Welcome back, everybody. Clearwater Jazz Holiday's Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Sessions. Alejandro, how are you?
Doing great.
Thank you for being with us. So Alejandro Arenas is back with us on a topic that he is calling, well, it's the second of a two-part series, maybe more, maybe a three-part or a four-part, who knows, musical composition, approaches and ideas, part 2. This is the second bass player we've had today talking about musical composition and charts and stuff like that. Alejandro, we had Brandon Robertson on earlier today with a pretty cool topic.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's a neat theme for today. Bass players talking about composition. I like it. So we have participants, as usual, are muted upon entering into these sessions, but if you have questions, don't hesitate to use the chat feature and we'll get those to Alejandro. And we hope you're taking advantage of all the recorded materials that we have on clearwaterjazz.com. The studio, which is brought to you by Blue Water Wealth Management at Steward Partners, is an archive of all the past recorded video sessions, and you can listen to all these sessions as well as some other programs we have on a podcast called the Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Sessions podcast. That's sponsored by Marine Max Clearwater, our great longtime partner. So, as always, send your feedback or any future session topics you might have to info@clearwaterjazz.com, and we will see what we can do. So let me tell you a little bit about Alejandro, turn it over to him. He's been a regular part of these sessions. If you can, check out the studio. You're going to see a bunch of sessions in there that he has done in the past already. There was a bass styles series where he did an approach to playing swing, funk, and more, an approach to playing Brazilian and Latin grooves. He did a more technical session on sound, from pickups and amps to technique and more, a history of rhythm section focus with his colleagues with La Lucha, and then harmony, a bass perspective, musical composition, part 1, approaches and ideas, today's part 2, and then another great one, fun with arranging, reimagining existing composition, which is something he has great experience with. So Alejandro was born in Colombia, where he started his musical career playing flamenco and classical guitar. He picked up the bass while he attended college in Bogota, where he performed in the salsa and Andean music ensembles, as well as the school's orchestra. During his high school years, he performed with different independent bands with styles ranging from salsa, blues, rock, and heavy metal. Upon graduating high school, he moved to Gainesville, Florida. There he worked as a freelance musician while being exposed to different genres such as reggae and jazz and funk. He earned an AA in music studies from Santa Fe Community College, where he worked unpacking books in the morning, studying during the day, and playing gigs by night. In the midst of this chaotic time in his life, he developed a deep love for jazz, which drove him to learn to play the upright bass. He holds a Bachelor's of Music in Jazz Performance and a Master of Music from the University of South Florida. During his studies at USF, he toured Italy, France, Germany. He did that with the Jazz Ensemble No. 1 and the Jazz Tet, performing at different jazz festivals. In addition to being an adjunct professor for the Mira program at St. Petersburg College, Alejandro is very active as a versatile performer, working with many artists. He also co-leads the award-winning group La Lucha, who, by the way, have a new album recently out. Please check that out wherever you stream your music, or go to La Lucha's website. It is called Everybody Wants to Rule the World. La Lucha has already been a guest with us, and this is Alejandro's, I don't even know what appearance with this program in the virtual sessions, but we are always happy to have him as being a wonderful addition to this growing treasure. Alejandro, welcome back, my friend. The stage is up.
Thank you, Steve. I'm always glad to be back, and this is the first two-part series I've done. A lot of the kind of topics that we've talked about, that I have talked about in the past, we can certainly go deeper. That's the beauty and also frustrating part about music. You can study it forever and never feel like you've gotten to the point where you want to be. But that's the beauty of it. It's more positive than negative. You have certain days where you feel like, oh, okay, maybe I don't know what I'm doing. And then there's days that you feel pretty good about yourself, and so it goes, So the grind happens in any sort of job that you're doing, really. That there's days that you want to do it, there's days you don't want to do it. But that being said, since we're going to talk about composition today, it's a good, so I'm going to mention some things that I mentioned on the first part, kind of diving a little bit deeper into some of the concepts, and we're going to talk about a few new things, but it's all connected. And that's kind of a good segue, because with music, everything is connected to a certain extent. So as a performer, mainly, I'm mostly a performer. People call me to be a sideman. I also co-lead La Lucha, as Steve mentioned, and I kind of have to wear a bunch of different hats whenever I play with different groups. And the beauty of that is that I get to learn firsthand from a lot of those musicians. I also get to play a lot of original music that's written by other people. So that I love playing original music, because I absorb some of that myself for my own compositions and my own learning and my own approach to music. So being able to kind of navigate that area of being a performer but also writing your own music is great, because, like I said, it's all connected. We're all part of the music cosmos, if you will, or the universe. In any case, without getting much deeper or esoteric than that. Speaking of getting information from other people and absorbing that, so that's a vital thing of being a composer, developing your own sound, saying what it is that you want to say as a musician, especially in occasions that you may be, like, I'm a bass player, so a lot of the times my compositions don't necessarily feature the bass as the lead voice. There's a lot of bass players that write music on the bass for the bass to be the lead voice, but I rarely find myself doing that. I've always enjoyed playing the bass in an ensemble situation, and I love the interaction with other musicians and what each person brings to the table. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with the bass being a lead instrument. There's certainly fantastic musicians and bass players that can do that really well. But a lot of the times I have to put myself in that, I'm providing the foundation to whatever it is. And yes, a lot of my music starts with the bass as the foundational element, and then I can build stuff on it. But one of the elements that I talked about last week, so not last week, but the last class was coming up with a melody by itself without any context, sometimes without meter, sometimes without harmony, sometimes without either one of those things, just a melody. It can be a series of notes of any sort. You can start with just quarter notes and then change it. So that's kind of an exercise, but I talk about that on the first session a little bit. But what I wanted to expand with mentioning influences is that to develop your sound, you imitate. It's well known with some famous composers that they, I don't want to use the term, what's the proper term? They borrow. They borrow from other composers. So I think borrowing is great as long as it's not plagiarizing. Because there's giants that came before us that have written incredible music, and by studying them and borrowing from their ideas, it is that we do what we do. So it's the same thing as an instrumentalist or a performer of any sort, really. You learn from other people, and by imitating initially or borrowing from those ideas, you create your own sound. It's very much like that for writing music. So specifically, melodies. So one good way, something that I like to do to kind of inspire myself and not, like I mentioned, I'm a bass player and I rarely use the bass as a lead instrument. And part of the reason for that is because I don't write a lot of melodies on the bass. And part of the reason I don't purposely avoid it, but I usually go to the keyboard, which is an instrument I'm not as well versed on. And I do that purposely because it allows me to think of melodies in a different way. In other words, on the bass, I'm much more comfortable with what I'm doing. So I'm going to gravitate towards things that I already know how to play. So there's going to be a lot of patterns that are already in my fingers, and by default, I catch myself kind of doing very similar melodies or very similar things. So one way for me to get away from that is go to an instrument that I don't know that well, that I can still produce sound on, but not force myself, that's a terrible thing to say, but try to play around and see what kind of melodies show up. So, for example, with the keyboard, everything's laid out for you. The difference with the bass, the certain intervals are actually harder to play on the keyboard. So some of those things are easier on the bass. So you're not going to tend to go to play that on the keyboard by default if that's something that you're used to doing. It's just each instrument has different patterns that you can play around with. So to me, one good idea is to go to, like I said, the keyboard if that's not your main instrument, and figure out a way to create melodies that are, sometimes I just sit down and just start playing random stuff to see if something comes out. Another thing that I mentioned, a way to create melodies is away from the instrument, is actually to sing something. If you get an idea in your head or something like that, just sing it and record it. Like I said, I covered that on my first topic. But that's, the melody is I focus a lot on the melody because of that. Now, melodies, I find myself being inspired by a lot of music that I grew up with, or music that I'm listening to at the moment. So, like I say, I try not to. I hope I'm not plagiarizing. I certainly, if I have, I haven't done it on purpose. But there was a funny story of Benny Golson talking to Horace Silver. It's on a DVD about A Great Day in Harlem, but he talks about like, oh man, don't you hate when you have this beautiful melody in your head? It's like in your dreams, and you wake up, you write it down, and you just realize that it was, it's like Alone Together, some standard that already exists, and you just kind of rewrote it by accident. So that can happen. That's you're all familiar with kind of high-profile cases of plagiarism recently. So, but the ideas that I try to get from that are whatever sticks in my head. Some things that I enjoy listening from those styles of music. So, in my particular case, one thing that keeps kind of popping out as I get older is I grew up in Colombia, and I didn't really grow up listening to a lot of like the music of my country. Because it's there, that it just kind of happens that it's everywhere, so you kind of hear it. It's nothing, you don't realize how special it is. And when I moved to the United States, I kind of started revisiting that music and realized how rich it was and how much identity that music has based on the culture and the rhythms and all that stuff. So I found myself kind of looking at those styles and trying to use some of those styles with the way I grew up. So the way I find that balance a lot is using some of the jazz harmony, of course, which is always really cool because with jazz harmony you can create a lot of thicker chords and richer textures. But sometimes I try to use catchier melodies or things like that. And then also some of the rhythms. because that's kind of a good balance between all those things that are who they made me. And another thing, that I grew up playing a lot of heavy metal. So sometimes I find myself playing like these metal sounding riffs, and I just include them into some of my compositions. Some of them I've had, like, I wrote this song 25 years ago when I used to be in a metal band, and I still remember the riff, and I never did anything with it, so I inserted in certain compositions. So, for example, I'll show you a little thing. This is a song that I wrote a few years back. It's called El Juego, and it's kind of a hybrid groove. It's not really a cumbia, but it's just a little bass. It started with a bass line. I just wrote this simple melody around it, and it just kind of became this whole thing. And then there's a section, I'm going to kind of fast forward to that section where it was actually a riff from a metal band that I used to be in, that I wrote a song for. So let me see, I'll play a little bit from the beginning here. Let me see, make sure this is sharing. So that was the initial bass line that I came up with. That little run that I had there at the end, that was actually, you could play that with distortion on an electric guitar, and it's very metal. And that's where I got that little run from. And then there's a part, let me see at the end. Yeah, this part I'm going to play a little bit back here. Sorry, I don't know the marking here, but... So that was the other part of the riff. It's like this. So it's just like a kind of a recycled riff that I had. But I don't like, I always like this, so I don't like to get ideas go to waste. So sometimes you'll find that you can write snippets of songs and you never realize what you may be able to cut and paste together. In fact, in the pop world, there's a lot of people that work that way. There's a lot of producers that create beats and stuff like that, and then they end up piecing things together. They kind of have a catalog of things that they've done and say, like, oh, you remember that beat we did, 2 years ago for this that we never used? I think that would work for the bridge of this song, or something like that. That happens. Especially with technology, it's a lot easier to change keys or different things like that. So it's a completely different, it's its own kind of art form. Because I'm not going to put it down, because there's very, very talented people that are able to do that. And actually, speaking of technology, I think that's a great way to kind of test out your songs if you're not sure about how certain things are going to sound together and you don't have a band to run it with. Definitely, use some multi-tracking. Nowadays there's GarageBand or Logic or a bunch of different things that you can actually record some of the parts and hear it. Or even if you're notating it on Finale or Sibelius, you can import the MIDI to get better sound from instruments into like a DAW. So there's a lot of different ways that you can go about it. I mean, there were composers that used to write stuff on napkins. Like I remember reading about Duke Ellington just being in a train and he would just write stuff on a piece of paper, that he had ideas, which is awesome, but we also have the technology. I think Duke may have used a MacBook with GarageBand or something if he had it to say that. Who knows? I'm not, I probably, there's some people out there raging now about me saying that probably. But in any case, yeah, use the tools that you have at your disposal to create music, whatever the music may be. I know I've tried to do that where I've created demos of just simple things because I want to hear how those things sound together. And sometimes I play all the parts just to get a human feel and not necessarily the finale or a notation software playing it back for you in awful MIDI sound. So, I got my workstation with a keyboard. I got my bass handy. You can see electric upright bass back there, and I have a few other things. You don't want to see the rest of the room is a mess. But there's a drum set over here. I don't play that as much, but sometimes I get the idea. So it's cool to have the tools to try to come up with something. So, going back to that composition that I was showing you, that again, it's ideas that I collected throughout the years, and I had an idea and I was able to insert it there in a kind of for a drum solo. So that was that. I used some of my past influences and some of my kind of like Latin background and some of the jazz harmony to create something that is uniquely mine. I like to think about it that way, for better or worse, whether you loved it or not. Because that's the other thing. Composition is completely subjective. Your music is going to sound different to every person. Every listener listens to the music. They hear the music differently. I think we talked about in one of the past sessions about nostalgia and how you listen to a recording. I think it was on the arranging session. I think Steve asked a question at the end, and we talked about that, how listening to an original recording of something makes you feel, and there's all sorts of emotions attached to that feeling. So the same thing is going to happen with your own music. Eventually, those emotions are going to be, hopefully, good emotions are going to be attached to that for somebody. However, I think it's very important to write something with a purpose, to be able to, if you want to write an ugly song about an ugly subject, because that's what you want to say, do it, but do it with conviction. Like to me, it was the famous story of the Rite of Spring of Stravinsky. The people rioted because it was like, they're like, this can't be music, and all that stuff. And now it's a classic, So yes, sometimes people will have reactions that you don't expect, but that's one of the things that I think it's important to note as far as music. If you're giving, I think it's better to give somebody a feeling, to have a reaction to your music, than not have one at all. If you just kind of, if you make good music to be ignored, then that's fine. I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it'll appeal to some people, but there's some people are going to have positive thoughts about it, positive feelings towards it, and there's people are going to have negative feelings towards it. So, but I think the most important thing is to have, like I said, purpose. Do it with conviction. Whatever it is that you choose to say with your composition, make sure that it is something that you do want to say. That, and again, and also be ready to maybe people to think of it as like, oh, is this a depressing song? Is this song sad to you? It makes me happy, That's the thing. That's the old joke about some Brazilian music. Like the happiest songs are the saddest ones, and the slow kind of depressing ones are the happiest ones. So again, it's culture, So that's a using your music however you want to. So another thing that I was going to talk about, theory. And using theory to write music. I find this a lot in jazz, and I find this, I've done it before myself, where I'm kind of like, oh, I like this sound, I'm going to write a song with this sound. So kind of the sound came before the song, and I write something around it, and cool, you can make it, you can craft something good that way. These days, I tend to gravitate more towards if an idea pops in my head, I try to. I used to write a lot, and I think I mentioned this in the past. I used to write a lot in bit by bit. Like I would get an idea, kind of like almost arrange every instrument around 4 bars, and then write the next 4 bars. And the issue that I kept finding is that sometimes those things didn't necessarily match. They didn't flow very well. My phrases were too short. So I started trying to write longer phrases at a time. And by the same time, technology was kind of hindering me, because I would kind of rely on notating those short phrases before I forgot them, instead of kind of like learning to play my own song before notating it. So it sounds kind of odd, but it was something that I realized that was affecting the flow of the music. Because when you're writing bit by bit, you may go back to realize that, okay, your ear gets used to hearing that idea over and over and over, and then it starts connecting things differently. So it's good to let your ears rest and go back and say like, oh, does this make sense? Again, that's the advantage of recording something too, even if it's a really rough demo, is that you can listen back to it and say, oh, okay, this makes sense together, or like, why did I decide to do this? And it's okay to revise yourself, but it also, if you find that your ear at some point was taking you someplace that the next you may feel a little bit uncomfortable about, maybe there was a reason for that. So again, it's all subjective. That's kind of the issue with composition. That's why after thousands of years of writing music, we're still talking about it because there's no formula. There's no specific way to write the perfect song. Some people have tried to find algorithms and all that stuff, and yeah, you can get pretty close to finding a really, really cool, poppy, catchy tune. But who knows? I mean, I've always believed that there's a lot of the human element attached to a performance. Same thing. There's some people that just own a song. There's performers that just own a specific composition, and I don't mean it's necessarily the composer playing it, but there are just people that connect to that specific composition, and they've kind of like record the quintessential version of that song. So that's another thing, writing something that you may find, if you're not the one performing it. I mean, this is one of the good things about having conviction about the work that you're doing, that you're going to perform it in a way that it's convincing to the listener as well. You did it with a purpose. Part of the issue that I find sometimes with having to record or have sidemen, or session musicians necessarily record a song, is that they may not be as into the song, but some of the great session players, they tend to be kind of musical chameleons, in the sense that they really just find everything that's cool about a song within a song. So being able to kind of do that, being able to be surrounded by musicians that are able to take your song and make it their own and take it to the next level is great. Because sometimes you may find a composition that's really good, and it just happens that it was performed poorly, or the people didn't get the idea of what it is that you were trying to express. So as a composer, if you're bringing your song to a group, make sure you get what you want to get out of it. So either that means that you're opening to each musician giving their own, and making the song their own, meaning that once you go and play with a different group, the song may sound slightly different, the feel or everything, the emotions behind it. But that's up to you to decide as a composer. I think one of the things that Steve asked is how specific do you get with what you write for a musician? And I guess it all depends on, I responded to the question, but like the short answer is like, it all depends on if you're getting what you want out of that composition from the musicians that are playing it. If you feel compelled to tell somebody, listen, that's not working at all, I want you to try something else, then it always helps to actually give people direction on what it is. I mean, some composers like to talk a lot about the emotion, and other ones just want the musician to come up with what it is, and they're cool with whatever they come up with. It's another way to let a performance or a composition grow into something more. Like I said, I like giving a little bit of freedom to the musicians that are playing the composition, because my approach has always been, as I mentioned, of melding with a group of people and coming up with something unique together, and I don't know, that's a personality trait, I don't know what it is, but in any case, so one thing too that's kind of related to that, and especially in this day and age, is I like to call it thinking like a producer. So one thing that I love about listening to like well-crafted pop albums is that there's a lot of little things that happen throughout records that only happen once, but they serve a purpose. They're not random. They're not, usually, that's why I mentioned specifically pop and well crafted, because that usually means that they spend time actually crafting the song or the performance or anything related to it to create something. And you can create that within jazz, absolutely. I think if there's a fault that jazz musicians tend to have because of the ability of the minimum technicality it takes to play jazz, we can get carried away and play too many notes sometimes. And if the song, don't get me wrong, if the song calls for it, absolutely do it. But I think it's cool to be able to think like a producer in the sense of you're looking as a performer within somebody's song, and both as a composer indicating what you want the musicians to play in the song. You should have a good idea of what you think works and not, kind of how I mentioned before, but then thinking of it in the big picture. So saying like, sometimes I find myself with, the group that I work with the most with my own compositions are La Lucha, and these are guys that I've known for years, and I have the freedom to sometimes tell Mark, like, hey, don't hit this snare on this part here, or to tell John, hey, don't play that rhythm there, or and they're very cool with it, because they understand that I have something in my head. And that's the hardest thing. I think that when you work on a composition, it's all natural to you. It comes from your own head. So I've been in situations where I think like, oh, yeah, this is a really simple tune that I just wrote. And then I bring it to a rehearsal, and some guys are struggling to read through it or play it, and then I realize like, okay, it sounds simple because I came up with it. It all came from here, so my ears already understand it. I can't assume that everybody's going to hear it the same way. So, being descriptive with what you want is good. Again, if you just want a very specific thing, just write it out and hire a musician that can play it. But if you want also to have the liberty if you want to allow the liberty to other musicians to do their thing on it, I think also allow that space. So don't be overbearing with those musicians. But as a composer, I guess if it's your baby, you do what you want to do with it. That there's no, there's composers in history that were curmudgeons and they're just like, well, we're difficult to get along with and all that stuff, but they got what they wanted. And there were all the guys that were like, yeah, man, do your thing. So there's no right or wrong way to doing that. But really kind of the whole idea is that you want to create the sound that you want to create. And kind of finishing the idea, thinking like a producer, not only from the perspective of what is going to be played, but how the sound is going to be. So choosing an instrument that's going to be played. So in a sense, you're kind of working more like an arranger at that point, which is a close connection. I mentioned in the first part of the series that I like to kind of write the basic skeleton of the song and then go back and arrange it. Once the tune sounds like a tune, I like to go and rearrange it, if anything, and being, so that kind of is borderline there between like being kind of a producer, arranger, and you're kind of doing all these things. But the beauty of that process is that you can create something more unique. Again, technology, we have like a million keywords available to us through like software and all these different things. And so if you have somebody that plays keyboards, you can create a bunch of different sounds. For basses, I like to use effects on the bass a lot just to create that and use those possibilities. So kind of orchestrate things a little bit differently. We did our second to last album. It's called Palante, which is kind of the more produced one that we did, and we used a lot of synthesizers. And we did that purposely because we wanted to kind of get away from the traditional piano trio sound. So there were a lot of things that, as composers, we were also arranging and doing all these different things. So that was a lot of fun to work on. But then we also, the song that I just played earlier, El Juego, from that same album. So we have kind of the more traditional acoustic stuff as well as a contrast. So to me, it's all about variety and using your influences and to say what you want to say as a composer. Again, the first part of this, if you skip straight to this part, dives a little bit more specifically into some stuff that I kind of mentioned in passing here or referenced. So watch that one if you've gone this far in this one without that. But it really is just write as much as you can, and that's the way you're going to develop your sound, and it's like practice. Anything that you do, the more you do, the better you get at it, and that's the basic gist of that. I could ramble on for another 45 minutes about other little things that you can do, but really just kind of, I think, who was it? Somebody asked Bob Mincer, it's like, how do you write music? And you just say, oh, just put the pen on the paper. Simple as that, right? Just get started with it, do it. If you're scared that somebody's not going to like it, well, too bad. Yeah, who cares? It's your music. You're doing with the music what you want to do, and you bring it to somebody. At whatever stage you are. Rufus Reid famously, I think I can't remember if he actually won a Grammy or not for a composition, but that he did somewhat recently. But after years of being, one of the most on-demand bassists and sidemen, he just decided to get into composition, and he wrote a beautiful piece, which was like, I may be misquoting this, but I think it was like his first like big band composition he had ever done, and I think at the very least he was nominated for a Grammy or a big award. So I don't have my facts in front of me, but at least I'm not claiming to be completely correct. But I know it was something remarkable. It was something that really was kind of like, oh, okay. He dove in a little bit late, but he did it the right way. And of course, again, as a sideman, he was able to work with all these incredible composers that were writing this amazing music, So then you bring that experience to, every time I play a song I like, I'm like, oh, I feel inspired to create something, not imitated necessarily, but it gives me a certain emotion that wants me, if it's something that I haven't really emoted before in music, I try to do that. Which brings me to styles, kind of going back to my roots and all that stuff. And I think that's also a really cool thing. We have, we're not bound by, we're only bound by whatever wall we put in front of ourselves in terms of what we can write, in terms of like, is it a jazz tune? Is it a vocal tune? Is it a pop tune? Is it a funk tune? Is it a heavy metal song? Like, to me personally, once I purposely try to stop writing hip jazz music. Not that I ever think I wrote hip jazz music, but I would revise and revise stuff. It's like, oh, I want to make this sound super hip, like, oh, this piano player is going to complain about this vanilla chord that I wrote here. It's like, you know what? This is what's coming out of me. I tweaked a few things, but for the most part, I try to just write the music that comes out of my soul, my heart, or even if it's a theory based, and just try to make it purposeful, make it mean something, and make it you'd be surprised how many times the audience will understand it, even if it's the song they've never heard before. I've had that experience a couple of times. I'm very, very happy to have had that experience where to play a song that somebody from the audience came and said like, oh, that was such a cool tune. What was that? And they said like, oh, it's something I wrote. And then they're like, bass players write music? No, just, it's always bass players jokes. I'm not going to get into that. But there's that. I mean, that and to me, yes, that's validation. A lot of the times we don't write for we write for ourselves, but I'm not gonna lie, I like it when people say they like my music. Just my human nature. I could pretend and say like, well, I don't care if you like it or not. I mean, by the same token, if somebody tells me, man, that really kind of sucked, then I'm like, well, you can't please everybody, so I'll take the positive comments and do with them what I want to do with them, and same thing with the negative comments. In the end, I said what I wanted to say, whether people liked it or not. That being said, I think that's all I have to say right now.
Well, that's a lot of good stuff to say, Alejandro. Hey, so I got a few ideas to throw your way and just get your feedback on them.
Yes.
You've got me thinking in terms of sort of like group collaboration and composition. And, you have that experience with La Lucha and with others, but, more immediately with La Lucha, I guess. And so of the pieces you have composed together, are there pieces that were not too heavily structured or influenced by any one of you? And if there were, how was then the piece ultimately created? That's kind of the one thing, is sort of what was that process together where any one of you didn't too heavily influence it, so you needed really something from each of you there to make it. And then the other part is, I kind of trying to make some analogies to just like group projects, group settings with people. When you work with people, a lot of times you have an idea that you immediately want to dismiss because you're just not feeling it, or you have some preconceived set that there's no way that works. And I'm just wondering, that has to happen in a musical sort of collaboration where your initial instinct is you just don't like it, you're not feeling it, you don't see it as a big picture. Has that happened to you, and then have you been surprised with trying to keep investing in that, keeping an open in mind and running with it? How does that work?
Yes, it is actually pretty difficult because that's why you can get a room with the best 4 musicians on each one of their instruments, considered the 4 best in the world. You may still get crappy music because it can, I wouldn't say crappy music, but it may not be as compelling as if you get 4 guys that are completely, or women or guys, that are just open to creating together, to be able to say, and yes, to answer kind of the question directly about La Lucha, sometimes at the beginning specifically, I had kind of an idea of what I wanted our music to sound like, and perhaps I was the more forceful one of the 3 of us to kind of say like, don't do that, or especially with John, because John came from a completely different background. Mark and I played with a bunch of like garage bands growing up and all that stuff. So we kind of knew the whole collective, let's write a song together and play the same song for 8 hours. And, whereas John came from a much more structured world, because he was classically trained from an early age. So he was kind of like, how do you jam, And John, being a doctor in neuroscience, he has a brilliant mind, but he just his perception of what we were trying to do was different. He was trying to do certain things, and I would tell him, like, avoid the obvious, avoid trying to do exactly what a pianist would do here. Try to think about it this way or something like that. And sometimes John usually is very receptive to stuff like that. So I'm very lucky in that sense, that I had two guys that were willing to put up with me. And same thing with Mark. Mark and I are always very in tune with each other's ideas, and with John too. Now, after so many years of playing, we've known each other very well. So we've had a couple of sets in some settings where it was acceptable, where we actually did completely improvised music, and it was pretty cool. Some good things happened where we were just kind of like, maybe sometimes I would call out a root to John, say like, oh, go to C here. Without telling him the quality of the chord. And the cool thing for him is like, okay, I'm forcing him to go to this chord, at least with this root, but then he could decide if the chord was going to be minor, major, altered, diminished, whatever. He could decide what he wanted to make that chord. So at least I'm playing the foundation, he's playing something on top of it, and it works well. And yes, I mean, in terms of trying to write a song together, it's kind of hard. I haven't really done it as much, other than like collective improvisation. Actually, on our last record, there's a song that we kind of wrote together. Mark wrote the bulk of it, but it was, I think, one of the first true kind of collaborations that we did. I mean, we always have input into each other's stuff, but this one was kind of Mark is a Blues for Houston person, and Mark brought the bulk of the song. He had kind of an A section, and deceptively, it's not really a blues. It's bluesy, but we call it Blues for Houston person, and it was obviously dedicated to Houston person. And he brought that idea, and then I said like, hey, let's tweak it. I think this ending sounds too similar to this. Let me come up with an idea. So I came up with like a couple of different ending phrases and kind of a melodic thing to take us onto the bridge, which the bridge was completely open and improvised. And that's kind of where John kind of stepped in and said like, oh yeah, I'm gonna play this on the improvised bridge. Let's play these chords. So it was kind of like we all trusted that we were gonna take the right choices, and I think it just that kind of happened when we were kind of trying to tune for the first time. I looked over at John and said like, hey, let's go to this, kind of like what I was referring to earlier. But yeah, a lot of the times you're gonna find people that are not open to your suggestions at all, and that's sometimes you just got to read the room in a sense. I tend to get pretty involved with the creative process in certain situations, so I love getting involved in the creative process, but I figure out that some people don't want me to do that. Some people just want me to play bass and shut up. And so I never do it because I think I have the right idea or a better idea or anything. Sometimes I just do it because I just love it. I just sometimes I get into that mentality of like, oh yeah, and I'm hearing this thing and I'm hearing this here, like I suggest, and then sometimes people take it, sometimes people just ignore it and say, or just simply say like, yeah, I don't that's not where I hear the tune going, But yeah, I think the key in a situation like that is to be, read the room and say, okay, well, there's not a lot of room. There's too many cooks in the kitchen. This is what I'm going to do on this, and but then once you have that opportunity to be with people that are completely open to that, to your suggestions and all of that, it's beautiful. We did a gig. We played a lot with James Suggs, and he helped us kind of fine tune some of the songs for the last album, and also Daniel Jordan, who's over in the Orlando area, great sax player, and those guys are like so cool because they just let us do whatever underneath them, and they just know where to go with us. It's kind of like, yeah, let's just do this. Okay, cool. Sometimes the gig, sometimes you're able to do it, sometimes you're not. So that's kind of the long answer is, yes, you do experience that situation sometimes of like we're in like a group setting when not everybody is open to that or willing to put their weight when asked to do that. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of artists are strange people.
I don't think you're strange, Alejandro.
It's the haircut.
Yeah, it's the haircut. It's looking good today, though. So no, that's a great feedback and good insight. It's definitely a challenging thing to do, but obviously it's the creative process, man, and you got to invest in it. And just like anything, I guess it's all about relationships, right? At the end of the day,
Exactly.
So you just got to feed off of that, and you guys.
For that matter, like an example I always like to use. You always see musicians like to discuss, like some musicians like to discuss, like, oh, like this drummer is better than this drummer or whatever. Very passionate about it. People always say like, oh yeah, Ringo was an awful drummer, and like, I'm like, okay, well, imagine Keith Moon or John Bonham playing with the Beatles. It's like, right. He's the wrong guy. You just got to have the right person for the job. And that's exactly the right personality. And all that stuff counts, and jazz too. Some of those famous groups, Elvin Jones with John Coltrane and those guys that were kind of unorthodox in their approach, but they just found that that group where they flourished. I mean, and Elvin was a fantastic drummer, but I've heard stories of people that said like, oh, it wasn't the easiest drummer to play with because of his approach, but he had a very specific thing that he wanted to do. Same thing with Coltrane, and that's why those guys found each other, and that's what the famous quote, the PG version of it is that somebody asked Elvin Jones like, how do you guys do that? How do you how do you guys play that music how do you create that music together? And then Elvin just said, you just got to be to die with the MF. that was his quote. You just got to, more or less, you just got to be, it's trusting each other.
That's a lot of it, right? Yeah. So I really appreciate you being part of this again today. It was another really great session. Thank you. Wanted to remind everybody that you're going to be back with us on Tuesday, September 29th for a second part of the arranging series. Fun with Arranging Part 2 is what we're calling it, but we're all looking forward to that. And so for those of you newer to these sessions, all of the upcoming sessions and the links to join those sessions are accessible at clearwaterjazz.com/education. It's the education and outreach section. There are Zoom links to join the live sessions. Oftentimes the guest musicians will have session materials or recommended listening links to like Spotify, our Spotify channel. And then after the fact, the sessions are archived in the studio. This session will be in the studio very soon, or on the Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Sessions podcast. So please check them out. There's a lot of wonderful stuff and a lot of wonderful musicians and educators sharing their wisdom, their gift, their talents, and their experience with us all. So Alejandro, on behalf of Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation, thanks for being part of this.
Thank you for having me.
And everybody out there, stay safe, be well, keep playing, and we'll see you soon.
Bye-bye. Bye.